Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most overlooked terrain features in elk hunting inches and why elk love them. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years. And I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent elk hunter and outdoorsman. If you've elk hunted long enough, you've probably experienced something that didn't quite make sense at the time. You hike up a steep mountain slope, side hill across dark timber, maybe climb another few hundred feet of elevation, and suddenly you step out onto a flat stretch of ground halfway up the mountain. The slope relaxes, the trees open up, the walking gets easier, and then you start noticing tracks everywhere, old droppings, maybe fresh droppings, rubs scattered along the timber edge, a faint trail cutting across the slope. Sometimes it feels like elk activity suddenly concentrates in that one little strip of terrain. That strip of terrain is called a bench. And once you truly understand how elk use benches, it will permanently change the way you read elk country. The reason is pretty simple. Elk are big animals, right? That live in steep terrain. They spend their entire lives balancing three things: security, energy efficiency, and environmental awareness. They need places where they can bed safely, move efficiently, and monitor what's happening around them without constantly burning calories climbing up and down the mountain. Benches give them exactly that. But here's the problem: most hunters don't recognize benches for what they are. A lot of hunters walk right across them without even realizing the importance of the terrain they're standing on. They're focused on chasing bugles or hiking towards the next basin or climbing higher because they assume elk always want to be at the top of the mountain. Meanwhile, the elk are often living right on those mid slope shelves. Benches act like natural platforms carved into the side of the mountain. They break up steep slopes and create horizontal structure where elk can bed, travel, feed, and stage movement between different parts of their daily routine. In many elk units across Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Colorado, benches are some of the most consistent pieces of terrain you'll find elk using year after year. Not because benches are magical, but because benches solve problems for elk. They allow elk to move across mountains without constantly climbing. They create bedding structure that works with wind and thermals. They connect feeding areas to security cover, and they give elk visibility and escape options that steep terrain alone just doesn't provide a lot of times. When you start recognizing benches and understanding how elk use them, you stop wandering mountains and hoping to stumble into elk. You're going to start hunting terrain systems. Instead of randomly hiking ridges and basins, you begin to see how elk structure their movement across the landscape. And once you start seeing benches through that lens, you're going to realize they often act like highways, bedrooms, and staging areas all at the same time. Today, we're going to break this down in a practical way. We're going to talk about what benches actually are, why elk prefer them for bedding, how they become natural travel corridors across steep country, how they influence elk movement patterns, and how you can identify the right benches on maps before you ever step foot into the unit. Then I'll walk you through how I personally approach hunting benches on public land, including positioning, wind discipline, and timing, because just knowing where benches exist doesn't guarantee you'll kill elk if you hunt them incorrectly. And finally, we'll talk about the mistakes a lot of hunters make when they start targeting benches so you don't fall into those same traps. Because once you understand benches, you're going to realize something important. A lot of the elk you've been looking for in big country have probably been standing on these terrain shelves the entire time. Let's start with the foundation. First, we need to talk about what a bench actually is and why so many hunters miss them completely when they're looking at the mountain. A bench is one of the simplest terrain features in the mountains, but it's also one of the most misunderstood. At its basic level, a bench is just a flat or gently sloping shelf that interrupts a steep mountainside. Instead of a slope continuing straight up and down, the terrain levels out for a stretch before continuing again. Those shelves can be small and narrow, maybe only 20 to 30 yards wide, or they can be hundreds of yards across. But regardless of the size, they all create the same thing: a break in steep terrain. If you've ever been hiking up a mountain and suddenly noticed the walking became easier for a short distance before the slope steepened again, you were probably standing on a bench. Benches form naturally over long periods of time, right? Through erosion, soil movement, and changes in rock layers. Harder rock resists that erosion while softer layers slowly wear away, leaving those horizontal shelves carved into the side of the mountain. Over time, vegetation grows differently on those flatter sections. Trails develop, and animals begin using them as part of their daily movement. But here's why a lot of hunters miss benches. When people look at mountains, they tend to think in terms of ridges and basins. Those big features are easy to recognize both on a map and with your eyes on the hill. Benches are more subtle. They don't jump out at you the same way a basin or a ridgeline does. Instead, they hide halfway up slopes, tucked into timber, or running quietly along the side of a mountain where a lot of hunters simply pass through without thinking about why the terrain actually changed. Another reason benches get overlooked is because many hunters assume elk prefer either the very top of the mountains or the very bottom near water. But elk spend a tremendous amount of time living in the middle elevation of a mountain slope. And that middle elevation is exactly where benches tend to form. Once you start recognizing benches, you're going to begin seeing them everywhere. And more importantly, you're going to start realizing that many of the tracks, droppings, and elk trails you've walked across in the past were concentrated there for a reason. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. If you spend enough time studying where elk actually bed, one pattern starts showing up over and over again. Elk consistently choose places that allow them to rest while still maintaining control of their surroundings. They want security, they want awareness, and they want efficiency. Benches naturally provide all three. First, benches give elk a more comfortable place to lie down compared to steep slopes. Elk are big animals. A mature bull can weigh up to 700 pounds, and laying on a steep hillside for hours isn't efficient or comfortable. A bench creates a relatively level platform where elk can bed without constantly shifting their position. It may seem like a small detail, but over the course of a long daylight bedding period, that stability matters. Second, benches allow elk to maintain visibility while still staying hidden. Many benches occur along the mid slope of mountains, often near the edge of timber or just below broken cover. When elk bed in those locations, they can position themselves so they're looking downhill while thick cover protects their backside. From that position, they can monitor anything moving up the slope toward them, which is exactly where danger often tries to approach. And third, benches work perfectly with wind and thermals. During the day, thermals generally rise uphill as the sun warms the mountain. Elk bedding on benches can position themselves so rising thermals carry scent below directly toward them. At the same time, prevailing winds often move across the slope, giving them additional scent coverage from the side. In other words, elk can smell downhill movement, detect side hill movement, and still maintain visual awareness of what's happening below them. That combination of comfort, wind advantage, and visibility all creates a bedding situation where elk feel extremely secure. And when elk feel secure, they stay in those locations longer and return to them more consistently. That's exactly why benches become such reliable bedding structure in elk country. Elk live in steep country, but that doesn't mean they want to spend their entire day climbing straight up and down mountains. Like any animal that survives by conserving energy, elk naturally look for the easiest way to move across the landscape. They still need to travel between feeding areas, bedding areas, water, and escape cover, but they prefer to do it in a way that minimizes unnecessary effort. Benches solve that problem. Instead of forcing elk to climb directly up a steep slope or descend sharply downhill, benches allow elk to travel sideways across the mountain, and those horizontal shelves act like natural pathways that connect different parts of the mountain system without requiring constant elevation change. If you've ever side hilled across a mountain yourself, you know exactly what I mean. Walking along a bench is dramatically easier than trying to side hill while you're dealing with all of that vertical. The terrain is more stable, footing is better, and movement becomes quieter and more efficient. Elk recognize this just like we do. Over time, repeated use of benches naturally creates trails. You'll often find faint elk paths cutting across those shelves, sometimes running hundreds of yards or even miles in some places along the contour of the mountain. Those trails allow elk to move efficiently between feeding slopes, bedding pockets, and escape cover, all without constantly exposing themselves on ridges or draining energy trying to climb up and down that steep terrain. Benches also allow elk to move while staying partially hidden. When elk travel along a bench inside timber or just below the crest of a slope, they remain concealed from animals or hunters above them on the ridge, and from below, anything looking up the valley is going to have a hard time. That side hill position keeps them in cover while still allowing them to move steadily across the mountain. Because of this, benches often become predictable travel routes that elk use repeatedly throughout the season from early to late. All year round, really. When you start identifying those routes, you're no longer guessing where elk might move. You're hunting the terrain features that quietly guide their movement every single day. One of the biggest advantages benches provide for elk hunters is that they create structure in how elk move across a mountain. Elk rarely wander randomly through steep terrain. Their movement usually follows logical routes for them that allow them to travel efficiently while maintaining security. When you begin studying mountains through that lens, benches start standing out as natural connectors between the places elk like to go every day. Think about the basic daily routine of elk. During the night and early morning, elk typically feed in more open areas. That might be alpine basins or parks or south-facing slopes with good grass growth, old burns, or open timber where forage is abundant. As daylight approaches, elk begin moving towards secure bedding areas where they'll spend a lot of the day resting and just chewing their cud. Those bedding areas are often located in thicker cover on mid-slope terrain where wind, thermals, and security all come together for them. Benches frequently sit right between those two environments. Because benches run horizontally across the mountain, they naturally link feeding areas above or below them with bedding cover tucked into timber. Elk can feed in open country during low light, then drift along a bench as they move forward towards bedding security once daylight increases. This is where elk movement starts becoming more predictable. Instead of climbing straight uphill or dropping straight into a valley, elk can slide along those terrain shelves while staying inside cover. And that side hill movement allows them to travel quietly, conserve energy, and avoid exposing themselves in open terrain. Benches also serve as escape routes, right? When elk feel pressure from hunters, predators, or other disturbances, they rarely sprint blindly downhill. More often, they're going to side hill along the mountain, using benches to move quickly and quietly into thicker cover, secondary bedding pockets, or even adjacent drainages. And that means benches don't just connect feeding areas to bedding areas, they connect entire terrain systems. And when you start identifying those connections on a mountain, you're going to begin to see the routes that elk are most likely to travel along before you ever see the animals themselves. One of the biggest advantages modern hunters have today is the ability to identify terrain before ever stepping foot in a unit. Long before opening day, you can sit down with digital maps and start identifying benches that have strong potential to hold elk. The key is learning how to read contour lines correctly. On a topographic map, steep terrain is represented by contour lines that are very close together. The tighter those lines stack, the steeper the slope becomes. When those lines begin spreading further apart, the terrain is flattening out. And that flattening is often where those benches exist, especially if it's in mid slope. When you're e-scouting elk country, one of the easiest ways to spot a bench is by looking for a section where tightly stacked contour lines suddenly widen for a short distance and then tighten back up again above or below. That pattern usually indicates a shelf is cut into the mountainside. Sometimes those benches appear as long horizontal stretches that wrap around the mountain. Other times they show up as just small pockets or ledges tucked into the slope. Both can hold elk, but longer benches that run across large sections of terrain often become the most consistent travel routes. Another thing I personally look for is benches located in the middle third of a mountain. Elk frequently prefer mid-slope bedding areas where they can take advantage of wind thermals and security like we discussed earlier. When a bench sits in that mid-elevation zone near timber or thick bedding cover, it immediately becomes a piece of terrain worth paying attention to. You should also look for benches that connect important habitat features. For example, a bench that runs between a feeding basin and a dark timber bedding cover can become a natural movement corridor. Similarly, benches that wrap around the head of a drainage or connect multiple side ridges often guide elk movement through that area. E-scouting benches doesn't guarantee elk will be there, obviously, but when you start marking benches on your maps before the season begins, you're building a terrain blueprint that dramatically shortens the learning curve once you step into the mountains. Once I identify benches that look promising, the next step is figuring out how to actually hunt them. And this is where a lot of hunters make mistakes because simply knowing a bench exists doesn't mean an elk are going to walk right past you automatically. You still have to approach it with the right wind, the right positioning, and the right timing. The first thing I pay attention to is wind and thermals. Benches are mid-slope features, which means they sit right in the zone where thermal movement becomes extremely important. In the morning, cooling air generally sinks downhill before the sun begins warming the slope. As the day progresses, thermals usually start rising uphill. If you approach a bench without understanding how that air is moving, you can easily push your scent right into bedding areas before you've ever even seen any elk. Because of that, I try to approach benches from the direction where the wind is most likely to stay in my favor. Many times that means coming in from above or from the side rather than climbing straight up towards the bench. The second thing I pay attention to is positioning relative to trails. Remember, benches often become travel corridors that elk use repeatedly. Instead of just wandering across the entire bench looking for sign, I try to focus on identifying the most worn trails or subtle routes where elk consistently move across the slope. Those travel lines are where encounters are most likely to happen. Timing is the third piece of the puzzle. Early in the morning, elk are often moving from feeding areas towards bedding cover through transition zones, and that movement frequently occurs along benches as they side hill towards security. In the evening, the same benches may become travel routes as elk begin drifting back towards the feed. Because of that, I try to position myself along those benches during those transition windows when elk are naturally moving already. When wind, positioning, and timing all line up, benches can become some of the most predictable places in elk country to encounter animals, and it's easier to pull them in with calls as well when they're already going to be traveling through there. Once hunters start learning about benches, there's a tendency to treat them like a guaranteed elk hotspot, though. People hear that elk love benches, so they start hiking directly to every bench they find on a map and assume elk are going to automatically be there. But that's just not how elk hunting works, right? Benches are important terrain features, but they only work when the rest of the system around them makes sense. If you ignore wind, pressure, and timing, benches can become completely empty pieces of terrain just like anywhere else. One of the biggest mistakes hunters make is approaching benches with the wrong wind. Because benches sit halfway up a slope, they're often located exactly where thermals are shifting through the day. If you climb directly upwards toward a bench when your scent is rising uphill, you're going to push your scent straight into that bedding cover before you ever realize elk are there. In pressured units especially, elk will often just slip right out long before you even see them. Another mistake is hunting benches at the wrong time of day. Many benches serve as travel routes between feeding areas and bedding cover. Many benches also serve as travel routes, right? As we discussed, between feeding areas and bedding cover. If you walk across those benches in the middle of the day when elk are already bedded nearby, you can bump animals that were using that area hours earlier and just bedded right off it. Then by the time evening movement begins, the elk have already relocated to another pocket of security cover. Pressure is another factor hunters underestimate. In popular elk units, benches are often some of the first places hunters check because they've heard elk use them. If multiple hunters are hiking the same terrain shelves in the morning, elk are going to quickly adjust their movement patterns. They may shift to benches in thicker timber, move higher or lower in the slope, or simply just start traveling through those areas after dark. Benches create opportunity, but they're not magic. They only become valuable when you hunt them with the same discipline you apply to every other part of elk hunting, paying attention to wind, pressure, timing, and how elk actually move through the terrain. Benches aren't magic terrain features that automatically hold elk, right? I'm not saying that. They're just simply pieces of mountain structure that naturally fit the way elk survive in steep country. When you understand why elk use them, comfort for bedding, efficient travel across slopes, and the ability to control wind and visibility, you start seeing benches for what they really are: functional terrain. Elk use the mountains in ways that conserve energy and maximize security. Benches allow them to move sideways across steep terrain instead of constantly climbing. They create natural bedding shelves where elk can monitor downhill movement while keeping the wind in their favor, and they quietly connect feeding areas, bedding cover, and escape routes in ways that a lot of hunters never notice. Once you start recognizing benches, the mountains begin to make more sense. You're going to stop wandering across random hillsides hoping to stumble into elk, and instead you're going to begin identifying the terrain features that quietly guide their daily movement. That shift is perspective, and it's important because successful elk hunting rarely comes from luck. It comes from learning how animals interact with the landscape, and benches are one of the clearest examples of terrain structure that elk rely on every single day. The more you learn to recognize them, the more predictable elk country becomes. If you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structural decision making, that is exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we have an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around the same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain. You can check out the Elk Camps at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital content vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all of you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.